The sound of steel ratcheting against bone was quieter than you'd expect. Not the dramatic clang of something breaking, just a small mechanical click, the kind of sound a seatbelt buckle makes, or a cabinet door latching shut. Ordinary, unremarkable. Except that it wasn't a seatbelt or a cabinet door. It was a pair of handcuffs closing around the wrists of a woman who had spent the last 19 years of her life preventing catastrophes that most Americans would never read about in any newspaper. The rain came down in diagonal sheets across the asphalt of the Gold's Gym parking lot in Fairfax, Virginia. The sodium lights overhead flickered against the wet blacktop, throwing long orange reflections across puddles that hadn't been there an hour ago. The parking lot was mostly empty at this hour, a few scattered cars near the entrance, a delivery van with a cracked taillight idling near the loading dock. The kind of anonymous, forgettable urban landscape that exists in every suburb of every major American city. The kind of place where nothing important ever happens. Except that tonight, something important was happening in the far corner of that lot, away from the lights, away from the entrance in the shadows, where an unmarked black Chevy Tahoe sat with its engine off. The woman being handcuffed did not scream. She did not fight. She did not beg. She had been trained at Quantico by instructors who had served in theaters of conflict that didn't appear on declassified maps, and her body's instinct, the deep physical knowledge of how to break the grip of the man touching her in under 2 seconds, was something she chose to override with the quiet authority of a mind that was already 11 steps ahead. Instead, she began to count, not backward from 10 as a breathing exercise, not prayers. She was counting violations. Each one a separate charge, a separate clause, in an indictment that was already writing itself in the back of her mind with the clean, precise language of a federal filing. She felt the cuffs tighten one notch beyond necessary, deliberately so, and she added that to the list and said nothing. The officer who had placed them on her wrists was 23 years old and had been on the street for 4 months. He stood in the rain behind her, breathing hard from the adrenaline, his hand trembling slightly against the metal of the handcuffs as he checked the locks. He thought he had just made the arrest of his career. He thought this was the story he would tell his father over the phone tonight. The story that would finally confirm what he had always needed. Confirmed that he belonged out here, that the badge on his chest meant something, that he was the law made flesh. He had no idea. He had no idea that the woman whose wrists he had just bound was the FBI's lead counterterrorism field agent on the East Coast, 19 years in service. 2 meritorious service medals the agent other agents called when they were in over their heads. He had no idea that 11 minutes earlier he had destroyed 21 months of an active federal investigation by pulling into this parking lot. He had no idea that at the precise moment he had shoved her against the wet side of her Tahoe, a man in Baltimore named Marcus Webb had driven past this lot, seen the flashing police lights, and kept going, the flash drive in his jacket pocket, the decryption keys untransferred, the transfer window opening like a wound in the dark. And he had no idea, could not have conceived of it, not in his most elaborate nightmare, that in destroying this operation in this parking lot on this rainy Tuesday night, he had personally held the door open for the thieves who were right at this moment draining his own father's retirement account to the last dollar. The dashcam in his cruiser was running. It had been running since he'd pulled out of the precinct lot at the start of his shift. The little red light on the dashboard unit blinked quietly in the dark, patient and indifferent recording. Everything, the rain, the lights, the radio calls, every word spoken within range of its microphone. It recorded the lie he had told to dispatch. It recorded the 8 seconds he had spent staring at her federal credentials before deciding to arrest her anyway. It recorded every single syllable of a conversation that was going to become federal evidence, a training case study, and the document that would define the remaining years of Officer Cody Marsh's life. The dashcam did not know any of this, of course. It was a machine. It simply recorded. It was enough. Her name was Dara Okafor, and she had been many things in her 44 years. A girl from a 2-bedroom apartment in Southeast Washington who had learned early that the world was not arranged in her favor and had decided with the quiet ferocity that would come to define her to rearrange it. A student at Howard University who had graduated summa cum laude in criminal justice and political science while working two jobs to cover what her scholarship didn't. A woman who had sat in her FBI application interview at 24 and answered every question in a voice that did not shake even when the interviewer leaned back in his chair and asked with a particular brand of deep skepticism she would recognize for the rest of her career whether she understood the demands of the position. She understood. She had spent the subsequent 19 years demonstrating exactly how well. Dara Okafor was a senior special agent in the FBI's counterterrorism division assigned to the Washington field office. She was fluent in Arabic, French, and Portuguese. She had been cited twice for exceptional service in the field, once for the dismantling of a domestic financing network that had been moving money to overseas cells through a chain of food service franchises in the mid-Atlantic states, and once for a joint operation with Interpol that had disrupted a logistics pipeline supplying materials for improvised devices through a series of shell import companies. She had been shot at in El Paso. She had breached a safe house in Detroit at 4 a.m. in February and found what was inside before anyone else in the city knew it existed. She had briefed Senate staffers, testified in closed hearings, and once in circumstances that remained classified, had operated for 11 days under a cover identity in a city she was never supposed to have entered. Other agents called her the architect, not because she designed things, but because she built cases the way engineers build load-bearing structures, with the kind of precise, unromantic attention to stress points and failure modes that made them nearly impossible to knock down. Tonight, however, she did not look like any of this. Tonight, she looked like a woman who had come from the gym and was waiting for a friend. Black leggings, oversized gray hoodie, with a faded Howard University logo that was 10 years old and soft from washing. No jewelry except a simple silver watch. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, practical bun, not the kind you see in magazines, but the kind you put your hair in when you know you'll be sitting in a car for 3 hours and you need it out of your way. She was tall, 5'10", and the kind of lean that comes not from vanity, but from a life in which the body is a professional tool, maintained with the same pragmatic attention you'd give a piece of equipment you depend on. The Chevy Tahoe she sat in was government-issued, unmarked, and deliberately plain. Black exterior, no front plate standard for federal vehicles operating in a support capacity. The windows were tinted to the legal limit. The interior smelled faintly of the coffee she'd finished 2 hours ago, and the faint chemical neutrality of a car that gets cleaned by a federal motor pool on a schedule, rather than when the driver remembers to do it. On the passenger seat, her service weapon, a Glock 19, sat in its holster, clipped inside a black duffel bag, along with her badge folio. A second phone, a power bank, 3 protein bars, and a ruggedized laptop that was currently connected to a secure FBI network node through a mobile hotspot. The laptop screen showed a real-time financial transaction map. Data points moved across a digital geography, routing numbers, shell company names, a series of nested LLC structures that to anyone outside the operation looked like routine commercial banking activity. To Dara, they looked like a countdown. The operation was called Sovereign Ledger, though everyone in the task force simply called it the Ledger. It had been running for 21 months. It had consumed the work of 3 federal agencies, 2 international intelligence partners, 42,000 pages of subpoenaed financial records, 1 asset who had been compromised and had to be pulled out of a situation in Philadelphia at 2 a.m. with nothing but the clothes on his back, and 1 funeral, a junior analyst named Patrick Reeves who had died of a heart attack at 31 from stress and overwork, and the specific kind of damage that comes from spending 2 years staring at evidence of people planning to hurt other people and knowing you have to stop them before the paperwork catches up. The Ledger was a domestic financing cell. Their product was not weapons or propaganda, it was money. They moved illicit funds through a sophisticated network of shell companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, and legitimate business fronts, converting dirty money into clean capital that could be used to purchase materials, equipment, and logistics support for affiliated networks operating inside the United States. Their current project, the one that had brought Dara to this parking lot on this rainy Tuesday, involved a $3.8 million transfer of funds earmarked according to 3 independent intelligence sources for the acquisition of chemical precursors. The precursors themselves were legal. You could buy them separately at industrial supply companies across the country, no questions asked, as long as you bought them in quantities that didn't trigger regulatory flags. The Ledger's expertise was in buying them in exactly those quantities, through exactly the right intermediate companies, in exactly the configuration that kept each individual purchase invisible. It was, Dara had told her supervisor once, like watching someone assemble a rifle one screw at a time from 17 different hardware stores, each transaction, legal to some of them, lethal. She needed the flash drive. Her informant, a man named Marcus Webb, was a mid-level courier for the Ledger's financial operation. He didn't know the full scope of what he was moving. He had been recruited as a money transport specialist, told only what he needed to know, paid well, and kept deliberately ignorant of the downstream consequences of his work. 3 months ago, through a combination of patient cultivation by Dara's partner, Darnell Webb. No relation to the informant, and the natural human tendency of a person to recognize that they are on the wrong side of a situation and start looking for an exit. Marcus Webb had agreed to cooperate. The flash drive he was bringing tonight contained the decryption keys for the Ledger's primary transaction routing system. With those keys, the FBI could freeze the active transfer in real time, trace every node in the network simultaneously, and lock down the accounts before the money moved beyond the point of recovery. Without them, once the transfer window opened, the $3.8 million would begin washing through a series of cryptocurrency exchanges that had been specifically selected for their opacity, and it would be gone functionally unrecoverable within the hour. The transfer window was scheduled to open at 10:56 p.m. It was 10:41. Marcus Webb was 11 minutes late. Dara tapped the steering wheel with 2 fingers, not nervously but rhythmically, the way a musician taps a beat, and kept her eyes on the lot entrance. She checked the laptop screen. The transaction was staged but not yet executing. 3 rows over a patrol cruiser rolled slowly through the lot on what appeared to be a routine pass. She noted it, the way she noted everything, registered, filed, returned to the primary focus. A local patrol unit doing a loop. It happened. Most of the time, it meant nothing. She was about to look back at the laptop when the cruiser's headlights swept across the Tahoe and stopped. Dara closed the laptop lid. She thought, "Please, just keep going." The cruiser pulled up perpendicular to the Tahoe, blocking her in, and hit the spotlight. The light was blinding, a white wall of LED brilliance that swallowed everything, and Dara closed her eyes for a half second and thought about Marcus Webb with his flash drive and the transfer window and the 11 minutes that were now becoming 10. And she said quietly and entirely to herself in the dark behind her own eyelids, "Not tonight." Then she put both hands on the steering wheel, fingers splayed, and waited. Inside her badge folio, behind the gold FBI shield and the commission card with her photograph and clearance level, there was a laminated photograph. It was not standard issue. Agents weren't supposed to carry personal items in their credential holders. It was a security protocol, something about maintaining the integrity of the document in field conditions. Dara had been carrying this photograph for 3 years, and no one had ever said a word about it because no one who knew what it was would have asked her to remove it. The photograph was of a 19-year-old girl named Brianna Cole. She was smiling in it, a wide, unself-conscious smile, the kind you have when someone catches you mid-laugh, and you don't care how it looks. She was wearing a Howard University sweatshirt. She had been a sophomore. She had wanted to be an architect. 3 years ago, Dara had arrived at a scene 6 minutes too late. She had stood on a sidewalk in a city she'd been stationed in for 2 years and looked at what the 6 minutes had cost, and she had made herself look at all of it without looking away. And she had carried Brianna Cole's photograph in her badge folio every day since, as a reminder of the specific human weight of what she was doing and why she could not afford to fail. She was thinking about Brianna Cole when the flashlight beam hit her face through the open window. And she was thinking about Brianna Cole and the transfer window and the 11 minutes becoming 10 when Officer Cody Marsh opened his mouth and said in a voice that had not yet learned the difference between authority and aggression, "Hands where I can see them." 20 minutes earlier, and 3 miles away on a quiet side street off Braddock Road, Cody Marsh had pulled over a 2019 Honda Accord for a lane drift that had not happened. He had been behind the car for 4 blocks before he turned on the lights. The Accord was clean, maintained, properly registered, moving at 28 in a 30. The driver, a black man in his early 30s wearing a dress shirt with the collar loosened the way a man loosens it after a long day at work, had pulled over immediately calmly, both hands visible on the wheel, before Cody had even reached the window. The man's name, though, Cody did not know this and did not ask, was Robert Ellis. Robert Ellis was a certified public accountant who worked for a mid-size firm in Tyson's Corner. He had a spotless driving record, not a single citation in 11 years of licensed operation. He had a daughter named Maya who was 6 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs. He drove this particular route home every night because it avoided the worst of the late commuter traffic. He had never in his life drifted across the center line of a road that he was the only vehicle on. Cody took his time approaching the window. He had learned this from watching his father. The deliberate pace, the hand resting on the holster, not gripping it, but resting. The way you let a person feel the weight of what you represented before you said a word. His father had called it command presence. He had talked about it the way other fathers talked about family recipes or sports teams. Something passed down, something owned something that defined who you were. Robert Ellis handed over his license and registration without being asked. His voice was careful and polite in the way that careful, polite black men are careful and polite when there is a police officer at their window at night and they want to get home to their 6-year-old. He said, "Good evening, officer," and waited. Cody kept the flashlight on his face longer than necessary. He scanned the car's interior twice, slowly, and found nothing. He ran the plates. Clean. He ran the license. Clean. He handed both back and wrote the citation anyway. Lane drift, failure to maintain lane. Cody signed his name at the bottom with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and expected it to be uncontested. Robert Ellis took the citation. He looked at it for a moment, just a moment, with an expression that was not anger exactly and not quite defeat. It was something in between, something that had no clean name, a kind of exhausted recognition. He said, "Thank you, officer," and rolled up his window and drove away at exactly 28 miles per hour. Cody watched him go and felt large, purposeful, like he had done something. He drove away without looking in his rearview mirror. Cody Marsh had grown up in a house where the badge was a kind of religion. His father, Warren Marsh, had served 22 years with Fairfax County PD, making captain by his 15th year, and had treated that fact with the reverence some men reserve for military service or great personal sacrifice. The Marsh family had bled for this county. Warren said often, and with the particular emphasis of a man who believed that repetition was the same as proof. The county owed them something. The badge guaranteed them something. Authority in Warren Marsh's understanding of the world was not earned through each individual interaction, but carried forward like a credit balance from the accumulated weight of years served. Cody had inherited this understanding the way you inherit eye color. He hadn't chosen it. He had simply absorbed it through years of dinner table stories and ride-alongs, and the way his father's friends at the department had always looked at him. Warren's kid going to be a cop someday, just like his old man, with an approval that felt like identity. He was 23 years old, and he had been on the street for 4 months, and he had not yet made a felony arrest. This was in his mind a failure. Not because the academy instructors had told him felony arrests were a metric. They had in fact told him the opposite, that the work was mostly documentation and community presence and the slow accumulation of trust. But that was not what his father had told him. His father had told him that real police work was in the moment of contact, the instant when you had a read on a person and you acted on it and you were right and the world bent to your authority because you deserved it to. Cody was tired of noise complaints. He was tired of expired registrations and parking disputes and the feral cat call, the actual feral cat call, a woman in a Reston townhome who had called 911 because a neighborhood cat had gotten into her garage and Cody had spent 45 minutes removing it. and his father had not laughed when he told the story, had simply looked at him with an expression of resigned disappointment that was worse than any reprimand. He wanted a felony. He wanted to feel like a real police officer. And when his headlights swept across the dark corner of the Gold's Gym parking lot and caught the reflective tint of the Tahoe's windows, and he saw the silhouette of a figure hunched over something glowing inside, his instincts, trained, if you could call it that, by a combination of the academy and his father's stories, and 4 months of a street that had not given him what he thought it owed him, fired in a direction that a more experienced officer, a wiser officer, a less hungry officer, would never have gone. His philosophy, stated in his own words once to a fellow rookie at the academy over bad cafeteria coffee, was simple. You give them an inch, they take a mile. The first one to blink loses. You are the law. You act like it. He had not invented this. He had heard it so many times in so many forms from the man who had raised him that it had become indistinguishable from his own thoughts, worn smooth by repetition, polished into something that felt like wisdom, because it had the density and confidence of a thing believed completely. He swung the cruiser around without radioing dispatch. He hit the spotlight. And Officer Cody Marsh, 4 months into his career, full of his father's certainty and his own hunger, began the worst decision of his life. The spotlight hit Dara's face like a physical thing, white and absolute, erasing everything in the windshield beyond its perimeter. She squinted against it automatically and then controlled the reaction and kept her eyes steady. She had been in this situation before. Not the parking lot, not the rain, not the specific tactical geometry of this night, but the essential situation, a person with institutional authority deciding without evidence that she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be addressed. She had been in this situation before she joined the FBI. She had been in this situation since she was 16 years old and drove her mother's car to the grocery store for the first time. She rolled the window down before the officer reached it. Both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2 fingers splayed. Dome light on. She had turned the dome light on before he even got out of his car, because she had learned not from training, but from living, that visibility was the first negotiation. He walked with the exaggerated deliberateness of a man performing authority rather than embodying it. The slight backward lean of the torso, the chin tucked, the hand resting on the holster, with theatrical casualness. The flashlight up in the left hand aimed at face level. Dara clocked all of it without expression. She gave him a moment to speak first. It was a professional courtesy she extended without expectation of reciprocation. Hands where I can see them. His first 4 words, and they told her everything she needed to know about the next several minutes. Not good evening, not is everything okay tonight. A command immediate and unqualified. Addressed to someone already compliant, hands already visible, already on the wheel, already doing every single thing the protocol existed to ask for. The command didn't come from a read of the situation. It came from a script. My hands are on the wheel, Officer Dara said. Her voice was calm and projected, the way the voice of a person used to being heard projects, not loud and not deferential, but clear. Can you lower the light? I'm blinded. I ask the questions, he said. She looked at his nameplate when the flashlight beam dropped half an inch. Marsh. She put it away. What are you doing back here? Marsh said. This is private property. I'm waiting for a friend, Dara said. I have a membership here. He demanded her identification with the word now at the end of it, the way a person adds now to a word when they want the word to carry more weight than it already does. Dara moved with the deliberate telegraphing of every movement that the situation required. She told him what she was reaching for before she reached for it. Her wallet was on the passenger seat. So was the black duffel containing her service weapon and her badge folio. She decided to lead with the driver's license first, not because she was concealing anything, but because she had read this officer in approximately 45 seconds, and she knew that leading with a federal badge was likely to escalate rather than resolve. That the smart play was to offer the simplest credential. First, let him settle himself, and then introduce the full picture in a sequence his ego could manage. It was a generous calculation. It was also wrong in retrospect, not because the strategy was flawed, but because the ego she was trying to manage was not manageable in the way she had assumed. She handed the license out the window. He snatched it. He read her name aloud. Dara Okafor. The way he said it had a particular texture, the slight elongation on the last name, the pause before it, the way his eyes moved from the card to her face and back again with an assessment that was not about verification. He looked at the Tahoe. He noted the absent front plate, which on a federal vehicle was standard and which to Officer Cody Marsh was a violation. "Get out of the car," he said. Dara did not move immediately. "Officer, is that necessary? I haven't committed a crime. I'm sitting in a parking lot." "I said get out of the car," he said louder now, and his hand moved not to draw but to hover, the hand twitching in the direction of his weapon, in the way of a man who has learned that the gesture is a language all its own. Failure to comply is an arrestable offense. "Step out now," she assessed him. The assessment took approximately 3 seconds and produced a conclusion that was coldly practical. This officer was past the point where reason was going to reach him in this moment. He was running on adrenaline, and the internal narrative he had already constructed, the suspicious vehicle, the dark corner, the driver who didn't immediately collapse into compliance, all of it feeding a story he had decided was true before he got out of his car. If she argued further, he would escalate. If she got out, she could show him the badge at close range and send him on his way before the transfer window opened. She said okay, and stepped out. She was taller than he expected. She could see it in the slight recalibration of his stance when she stood, the microscopic adjustment a person makes when the physical reality of a situation does not match their mental image of it. He had expected someone smaller, someone more easily managed. She stood at her full height in the rain and the parking lot's sodium light, and said levelly, I think there's a misunderstanding, officer. If you look in my bag, you'll see my badge. I'm a federal agent." He froze for a half second. Then the smirk came, the particular smirk of a man who has heard everything and is immune to being surprised or believes himself to be. His training officer, he remembered, had told him, "Don't let them talk their way out. Everyone was somebody important when they got caught. The rule existed for a reason." "Yeah," he said, "and I'm the police commissioner. Hands on the roof." The rain intensified. Dara put her hands on the wet roof of the Tahoe and felt the cold of it against her palms, and thought about the transfer window, and Marcus Webb somewhere in the dark, and the $3.8 million that was staged and ready to move like water behind a dam. "I'm searching the vehicle for narcotics," Marsh said from behind her. "You do not have probable cause to search my vehicle," Dara said. Her voice dropped an octave, not angrily, but with precision, the way you drop your voice when you want what you are saying to carry specific weight. It was not a question. It was a statement of law, clean and unambiguous. "And you are making a very serious mistake." "I smell marijuana," Marsh said. The 3 words landed in the rainy air between them, with the flat, practiced ease of a person reciting something memorized. The oldest manufactured probable cause in the book. Dara had heard it deployed before. She had read case files in which it appeared so many times across so many different officers in so many different jurisdictions that it had the quality of a corporate boilerplate, a standard clause in a standard form filled in without thought. "You smell rain and exhaust," she said. "You're lying, Officer Marsh." She said his name the way she had said it to herself a moment ago, as a fact precisely placed with the specific weight of a person who has registered a detail and will not be releasing it. She saw the muscle in his jaw react. The use of his name spoken with that particular quality of dismissive certainty, the certainty of a person who is watching you from a higher floor and is not impressed by what they see, snapped something in him. She could see it happen. She had time to recognize it and to know that what was coming next was going to cost them both something, except that what it was going to cost them was wildly different in scale and consequence. He grabbed her wrist. "That's it," he said, his voice tight with something that was part rage and part relief. The relief of a person who has been looking for a justification and has just manufactured one. "You're under arrest." The physical contact changed everything in Dara's body before her mind caught up with it. 19 years of training and the specific neurological wiring of a person who has operated in dangerous environments produced an immediate involuntary response the assessment of the threat, the mapping of the solution, the pathway to neutralizing the contact in the space of approximately 2 seconds, a wrist lock and a leg sweep. The geometry of it was already present in her hands, her hips, her weight distribution. She overrode it completely. She did not move. She did not pull away. She held perfectly, devastatingly still, and said in the clearest voice she had used all night, "Stop. Officer Marsh, listen to me very carefully. My credentials are in the passenger bag. It is a federal commission. I am on an active operation. If you cuff me, you are interfering with a federal investigation." He was not listening. The adrenaline had closed around his capacity for hearing the way shutters close around windows in a storm. Everything external reduced to noise. Only the internal narrative audible, and the internal narrative was running hot and fast toward the only conclusion it had ever been willing to reach. He spun her around. The force of it was more than necessary. Not a careful control hold, but a shove full weight behind it, the kind of movement a person uses when they want to establish dominance rather than secure compliance. Her cheek pressed against the cold, wet metal of the Tahoe. The rain was cold against the back of her neck. The smell of the car's exterior road grime, rain, the faint petroleum smell of wet asphalt was specific and immediate, and she filed it alongside everything else she was recording about this moment. "You are making a career-ending mistake," she said. Her voice was muffled against the metal, but distinct, deliberate, designed to be heard by the dashcam she had already identified as running in his cruiser. "Resisting arrest," Marsh said loudly, and she recognized the volume as performance, not communication to her, but narration for the recording. The verbal stage setting of a man building a case he did not have the facts to support. He yanked her left arm behind her back, high enough that the shoulder protested. "I am not resisting," Dara said clearly. "I am complying under duress." She felt him fumble with the handcuffs. His hands were shaking. She could feel the tremor transmitted through the metal, and she understood that the shaking was not fear of her, but the physiological aftermath of adrenaline, the body's own reckoning with what the mind had set in motion. He got the cuffs open, slapped the left wrist, grabbed the right, forced them together. Click, click. The sound was small and final, and exactly as loud as it needed to be. He began reciting Miranda in a breathless rush, the words blurring together from speed and excitement, and Dara waited until there was a gap and said quietly, "I know my rights better than you do, son." He spun her around to face him. He was breathing hard. There was a flush across his face that was partly exertion and partly something else. Something that Dara recognized from years of studying the faces of people in the moment of a decision they couldn't take back. A combination of excitement and the first hairline crack of doubt, sealed over immediately by the momentum of the decision itself. He felt powerful. He felt in control. He had the suspect in custody, and the situation was resolved, and the story had the shape of the story he had wanted. "My bag," Dara said. "You need to secure my weapon." He stopped. "You have a gun." "I am an FBI agent," she said with the patient measured cadence of a person explaining something elementary. "My service weapon is in a holster clipped to the inside of my bag. If you leave it in the vehicle and it is stolen, that liability belongs to you. Secure it." He blinked. The doubt tried again, wriggling up through the certainty like a worm through packed earth. He told himself she was bluffing. She had to be bluffing. Real FBI agents did not sit in dark parking lots in gym clothes. He told himself the badge was fake. People bought fake badges online all the time. He had heard this. He could not remember exactly where he had heard it, but he had heard it, and the fact of having heard it was sufficient to make it true tonight. He opened the rear door of the Charger and guided her inside. The back of a police cruiser is designed consciously or not to strip a person of dignity in increments. The seat is hard-molded plastic angled slightly forward, so there is no comfortable position. The legroom is designed for a person shorter than Dara. The smell is institutional disinfectant, laid over stale sweat with the faint metallic undertone that Dara associated with old violence and old fear, the residue of 100 nights of the worst hours of 100 people's lives. She sat awkwardly, hands pinned behind her, and watched through the plexiglass divider as Marsh went to her Tahoe. She watched him shine his flashlight through the passenger window. She watched him open the bag. She watched him pull out the Glock 19 and hold it up, and then she watched him pull out the leather folio. She watched him flip it open. Even through the rain-streaked cruiser window, she could see the gold of the shield catch the flashlight beam. She closed her eyes. She counted to 8. She was not counting for calm. She was counting the seconds it would take a person to examine that credential and the commission card beside it, and the holographic watermark that was a physical fact and not a matter of interpretation. 8 seconds was generous. 8 seconds was more than enough. She opened her eyes. Cody Marsh was still standing in the rain, staring at the open folio in his hand. She could read his body language the way she read everything, the slight forward lean that meant recognition, followed by the backward tilt that meant resistance to what the recognition meant. She watched the calculation happen in real time across the set of his shoulders and the angle of his head. She saw the moment it resolved. She saw him toss the folio back into the bag. She heard him faintly through the divider, and the rain climb back into the driver's seat. She heard his voice, sharp, performative, aimed at the dashcam microphone, that he either did not understand was federal property or did not yet grasp the consequences of Dispatch Unit 9. I have a suspect in custody at the Gold's Gym lot. Black female, early 40s, armed in possession of what appears to be a forged federal instrument. Running her in. The lie was now official, time-stamped, broadcast on a recorded line. "Found your forged little props, sweetheart," he said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror as he put the car in gear. His voice shook slightly, betraying him. The bravado was a costume that didn't quite fit. Carrying a forged federal badge is a felony. Add that to the list. Dara looked at his eyes in the mirror. They were wide and moving too fast. The eyes of a person who has committed to a direction and is driving faster toward it to avoid having time to reconsider. She said, "You checked the badge, Donovan. You saw it. You know it's real. Now you're kidnapping a federal officer to cover your mistake." "Shut up," he said. He hit the lights and sirens and pulled out of the parking lot. 3 rows over in the dark, Marcus Webb's headlights swept past the lot entrance. He saw the flashing lights. He kept driving. The flash drive stayed in his jacket pocket. At 10:56 p.m., the ledger's transfer window opened. The $3.8 million began to move. Dara felt the cruiser accelerate, and she looked out the rain-streaked window and thought about Brianna Cole and the photograph in the folio in Cody Marsh's trunk, and she thought about 21 months of work and Patrick Reeves, who had not made it to the end of it, and she made the decision, calm, clean, final, as a signature that Cody Marsh was going to pay for every second of this night in the currency of the rest of his life. The ride to the Fairfax County precinct took 11 minutes. Neither of them spoke for most of it. Marsh gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had lost color. He ran 2 yellows and a speed threshold violation that Dara noted with the same automatic precision with which she noted everything filed in the same mental column as the dispatch lie and the 8 seconds and the 2 tight cuffs. She watched the streets through the cruiser window and memorized the route, not because she needed to, but because the habit of observation was as automatic as breathing. Dara was not thinking about the charges. She was thinking about Tate, the operation's internal nickname for Marcus Webb, and what his disappearance meant for the next 48 hours. Webb was not a hardened operative. He was a frightened man who had made bad choices for several years and had, in a moment of clarity and perhaps self-preservation, decided to make a better one. That kind of cooperation was fragile. You could not leave it unattended. You could not let the silence of an unmet rendezvous build into the fear that told him the FBI had been compromised, that he was burned, that his only safe move was to disappear. Tate would surface again. She believed that, but every hour he spent underground was an hour in which the ledger could move, adapt, and close the window. The 21 months of work had prized open. For that, she thought, looking at the back of Cody Marsh's neck, he would pay. The Sallyport was a concrete cave lit by fluorescence that made everyone's skin look slightly wrong. The garage door rattled shut behind them with a sound like something final. Marsh hauled Dara out of the car, rougher than was necessary, and marched her toward the heavy steel door with the particular performance of a man who knows there are cameras in this space and wants his bearing on record. He was building a story. She could see the architecture of it, forceful, professional, in control. Handling a difficult arrest by the book. It was a competent performance. It was going to be completely dismantled. Behind the booking desk sat a man who introduced himself through his bearing and his 31 years of accumulated presence before he said a word. Sergeant Ray Dillon was built like furniture that had been in the same room for so long it had become part of the architecture. A push-broom mustache over a jaw that looked like it had been poured from concrete. Eyes that had seen everything the night shift could produce and had achieved a settled geological patience with all of it. He was eating a turkey sandwich and reading a fishing magazine. He looked up as Marsh came through the door. His eyes moved from Marsh to Dara. They stopped on Dara. He put down the sandwich. Marsh recited his charges: suspicious vehicle refusal to identify, resisting arrest, possession of forged federal instrument. Unregistered firearm with the breathless efficiency of a man who has rehearsed this on the drive over. He placed the evidence bag on the counter. Dillon raised one eyebrow, which was the most expression Dara had seen from him. He picked up the badge folio himself. He opened it. He held it up to the fluorescent light over the desk and tilted it once. The hologram flashed a specific multicolored shift in the metallic surface that was a physical reality, not a matter of opinion. He read the commission card. He looked at Dara. "Agent Okafor," he said. "Yes," she said. "Can you please instruct your officer to remove the cuffs? I've lost circulation in my thumbs." Dillon's face completed its journey from professionally neutral to a very specific shade of red that Dara associated with men who have been in law enforcement long enough to know exactly how bad a thing is and to feel the badness of it physically. He turned to Marsh. He said Marsh's name once in a voice like low thunder. Marsh, to his credit, in some narrow technical sense, tried one more time. He said the badge could be fake, that people bought them online. He said she had been suspicious, that she had refused to get out of the car, that the vehicle had no front plate. Dillon said, "Unlock her." It was not a request. It was the kind of statement that occupies the category above requests in the territory where orders become physical facts. "Sergeant, unlock her now," Dillon said, and the volume on the second version of the instruction was enough to stop everything in the room. The intake nurse froze. The officer at the far desk looked up from his paperwork. The television in the corner continued to murmur at a ceiling that was no longer paying attention. Marsh fumbled for his keys. The keys hit the floor with a sound that was somehow louder than it should have been. Dara watched Marsh bend down to pick them up. His hands were visibly shaking now, not the adrenaline tremor of the parking lot, but something else, something deeper. The physical expression of a person whose body has begun to understand what their mind is still refusing to accept. He got the key into the lock on the second attempt. The mechanism turned. The cuffs hung open. Dara brought her hands in front of her and held them up, palms out, in the fluorescent light. The deep red furrows etched into her dark skin at the wrist bones were precise and angry. The marks of cuffs applied deliberately one notch past the point of restraint into the territory of pain. She rotated her wrists slowly, feeling the returning circulation like heat, and then she looked at Marsh for the first time since he had shoved her against the Tahoe. He could not hold the look. His eyes went to the floor. Dara reached out her hand to Dillon. "My badge, Sergeant." Dillon handed it to her with both hands and the careful deliberateness of a man handling something he wishes he had been more careful about earlier. "Agent Okafor." "I apologize." "The rookie green is a color," Sergeant Dara said, clipping the badge onto the waistband of her leggings. "Incompetence is a liability." She turned to Marsh, who was standing against the booking desk with the deflated posture of a man whose costume has just been removed in public. The swagger was gone. What remained was a 23-year-old boy who was starting to understand the dimension of what he had done and who was managing that understanding very badly. "You have the right to remain silent," Dara said to him. Marsh blinked. "What I asked you in the car if you had a lawyer," she said. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and removed a cell phone. It was the one item Marsh had neglected to confiscate in the rush and the rain and the performance of the parking lot. Because you're going to need one. She dialed without hesitation. She did not scroll through a contact list. She knew the number the way she knew her own badge number by the specific weight of repetition burned into memory through use. It rang twice. Okafor. The voice on the other end was that of Assistant Director Leon Carter, who ran the Washington field office with the particular brand of contained total authority that came from spending 23 years doing the most consequential work in federal law enforcement and learning through that work exactly what was important and exactly what was noise. His voice at Dara checked the time on the phone, 11:09 p.m., on a Tuesday night, was identical to his voice at 9 in the morning, alert calibrated already ahead of the conversation. "Sir, it's Okafor." She put it on speaker. The room contracted around the sound of the call. Dylan stopped moving. Marsh stopped breathing. "The operation is blown. My CI is in the wind. I was detained by a patrol officer from Fairfax County. I'm currently in their booking area. He ignored my credentials and assaulted a federal officer." The silence on Carter's end lasted approximately 3 seconds. In that silence, Dara could feel the temperature of the room drop. "Are you injured superficially?" The cuffs were applied with excess force. "I have significant bruising at both wrists. Officer's name: Cody Marsh, Unit 9, Fairfax County." Another silence, shorter this time. "Put him on." Dara looked at Marsh. She held out the phone. Marsh took it the way a person takes a live grenade, understanding that there is no safe way to handle what he is holding, but that not taking it is its own kind of failure. He raised it to his ear. His hand was shaking so badly that the phone trembled against his face. The voice that came out of it was Carter's low-measured, terrifyingly calm. The voice of a man who has the institutional authority to end your professional existence and knows it and does not need to raise his voice to convey it. "Officer Marsh, you are going to listen to me very carefully. Your next actions will determine whether you end this night in your own bed or in federal custody. You will hand the phone back to Agent Okafor. You will step away from her. You will not speak to her, look at her, or approach her in any capacity. My tactical team is 4 minutes from your location. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Marsh said. His voice was a ruin. He handed the phone back to Dara. She took it without looking at him, put it back to her ear and said, "Sir, my team was staged for the ledger takedown," Carter said. "Since the element of surprise is gone, we're pivoting to asset recovery and damage assessment. Secure the scene. The dashcam footage from Marsh's vehicle is federal property as of this moment. Do not allow anyone to touch the data card. Copy. And Okafor, I want everything documented." "Already started," she said. She ended the call and looked at the room. Dylan was already on the landline, his voice low and urgent. The other officers in the booking area had stopped pretending to work and were simply standing the atmosphere of the room, having shifted in the way the atmosphere shifts before weather. A pressure change, a drop in temperature, the particular quality of air that precedes something large. Marsh was against the wall. He looked like something that had been deflated. The 4 months of swagger and the 23 years of his father's certainty had been drained out of him in approximately 90 seconds by a phone call he had not expected from a voice he had not been prepared for. And what remained was a young man who wanted desperately to call his father. He did not call his father. He stood against the wall and waited for what was coming because there was no longer any other option. The tactical team did not announce themselves with sirens. That was the first thing the night shift officers at Fairfax County noticed: the absence of sound. One moment the Sally Port was quiet, the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday night booking area, with the television murmuring and the fluorescents buzzing and Dylan talking in low tones on the landline. Then the lobby doors opened and 6 people walked in, and the quality of the quiet changed entirely. They wore FBI windbreakers over tactical vests, the yellow letters large and deliberate. They moved the way people move when movement is their profession. Fluid, economical, a contained violence of action that made the geometry of the room rearrange itself around them without a word being said. 2 to the front door, 2 to the hallway corridor, the remaining 2 to the flanking positions at the booking desk. Leading them was Special Agent Darnell Webb, Dara's partner of 7 years, who was large in the specific way of a person who has decided to be large as a professional choice, 6'4", built like architecture with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it had been designed for absorbing impact. He moved to Dara in a straight line, ignoring everything else in the room, and looked at her wrists. His jaw tightened. That was the only visible reaction. 7 years of working with Dara Okafor had given Darnell Webb a considerable vocabulary in restraint. "Operation is dead," Dara said before he could ask. Tate spooked when he saw the lights. He had the keys.
Darnell looked at her wrists again. A muscle moved in his cheek. "By the book," Dara said. "I want his badge, his weapon, and his dashcam data before anything else." Captain Gerald Foster arrived from the inner offices 30 seconds later, in a state that could most charitably be described as disorganized. He was red-faced and wearing his uniform with the collar button undone and the badge slightly off-center. The presentation of a man who had dressed in a hurry in the dark while someone was telling him something on the phone that he did not want to hear. He was a large man who had achieved his rank through 26 years of competent, unremarkable service and who had no framework in all of those 26 years for what was currently happening in his booking area. "Who are you people?" he said. "What is this?" Dara stepped forward. She held up her wrists. "Captain Foster, I'm Senior Special Agent Dara Okafor, FBI Counterterrorism. Your officer arrested me without probable cause at 22:43 this evening, assaulted me in the process of a false arrest, and in doing so destroyed an active federal counterterrorism operation that has been running for 21 months. She watched the sentence land. She watched Foster's eyes move from her wrists to the tactical team, to Marsh against the wall, and back to her wrists. He said Marsh's name in the way that senior officers say a name when they want the weight of their disappointment to be the primary communication quietly with great care, so that the person hearing it understands that the quiet is not the absence of anger, but the depth of it. "I want the dashcam data card," Dara said. "From his cruiser right now before this conversation goes further." Foster looked at Dylan. Dylan was already nodding. The card was pulled from Marsh's cruiser in the time it took Foster to stop looking like he wanted the floor to open. The card left the cruiser. Dara watched it happen. The small physical object, a thumbnail-sized piece of plastic and silicone, passed from the dashcam unit to Dylan's gloved hand to an evidence bag to Dara's custody, and in that journey became the most consequential piece of evidence in Cody Marsh's life. The conference room on the second floor of the Fairfax County precinct was the kind of room that had been designed for exactly the things it was being used for. Tonight, fluorescent lights in institutional fixtures. A long table of laminate wood chairs that had been chosen for durability rather than comfort. A whiteboard along one wall, and a large flat-screen monitor mounted opposite the whiteboard that was used for briefings and training videos, and tonight, for something else entirely. Marsh sat at the table alone for 7 minutes after he was walked up there by Dylan. 7 minutes in which the only sounds were the buzz of the lights and the distant noise of the precinct below. Radio's voices the normal infrastructure of a night that was normal for everyone else, and the sound of his own breathing, which was not entirely steady. He was thinking about his father, not about what Warren Marsh would do in his specific position. His father had never been in this position, had never, as far as Cody knew, been in a room alone waiting for consequences he had created through his own choices and could not undo. He was thinking about the voice, the specific layered confidence of his father's voice when he talked about the job, about the badge, about the way the world worked and the Marsh family's place in it. He was thinking about how that voice had been the primary architecture of his understanding of himself and his work, and about how that architecture felt, right now, at this specific moment, in this specific room, like a structure built on ground that had never been properly assessed. The door opened. The woman who entered was not Captain Foster. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a sharp navy suit over a white shirt with no jewelry, carrying a briefcase and a laptop, with close-cropped natural hair and an expression of absolute clinical neutrality. She placed her briefcase on the table and sat down and opened her laptop before she introduced herself, which was itself a communication. "I am not here for pleasantries, and this is not a conversation you are in charge of."
Lieutenant Nina Brooks, Internal Affairs, she said without looking up from the laptop. Sit down, Officer Marsh. He was already sitting. He did not point this out. Behind Brooks came Foster, then Dara Okafor, who had borrowed a first aid kit from the nursing station and wrapped her wrists in a light bandage that was visible against her dark skin below the cuffs of her hoodie, and then a man Marsh did not immediately recognize. The man was in his early 50s, wearing a precisely fitted charcoal suit and moved with the particular deliberate grace of a person who is accustomed to rooms in which his presence changes the composition. He sat at the table without introducing himself immediately, which was also a communication. Foster introduced him. Julian Thorne, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Marsh's hands went flat on the table. Thorne. He knew the name from a case study at the Academy, a civil rights prosecution that had been used as an example of successful federal oversight of local law enforcement. He had read about it with the detached interest of a student who does not expect to become a case study himself. He asked for his union representative. Brooks told him Gus Hartley was on his way. She told him that the administrative evidence review was beginning without Gus because Marsh's rights were protected and his employment status was not going to wait. She said this with the flat even-handedness of a person who has said it many times before and will say it many times after and means it every time. The monitor on the wall hummed to life. The image on it was a rainy parking lot. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 22:43. The image was sharp and clean. The dashcam had been a good unit recently maintained, nothing degraded or corrupted. And it showed the Gold's Gym parking lot from the perspective of a police cruiser sitting perpendicular to a black Tahoe. The room went quiet. The dashcam footage ran for 4 minutes and 16 seconds before Brooks paused it the first time. The room watched Cody Marsh's cruiser pull into the lot. They watched the spotlight hit the Tahoe's window. They watched Dara's hands go to the wheel before the officer even reached her window. They heard clearly, through the dashcam's microphone, Marsh's first words, "Hands where I can see them." They heard Dara's response. They heard the exchange about the light. Brooks paused the footage at the moment Marsh said, "I smell marijuana." She looked at Marsh. "Officer Marsh, did you recover any narcotics from the vehicle?" "No," Marsh said. "Any paraphernalia? A pipe, a lighter, rolling papers, anything that would support a marijuana use claim, Did you administer a field sobriety test at any point during this stop?" Brooks turned to Dara. "Agent Okafor, will you submit to a blood toxicology screen right now tonight, if I arrange it?" "Gladly," Dara said. "I haven't touched any controlled substance in my life, and certainly not while running a federal counterterrorism operation." Brooks turned back to Marsh. Her eyes, when they settled on him, had the quality of instruments rather than expressions precise and purpose-built, and entirely without the room for interpretation that human sympathy creates. So the statement, "I smell marijuana," was a fabricated justification for a vehicle search to which you had no legal right. Is that a fair characterization of what we're looking at? Marsh said nothing. Admitting it ended his career. Denying it was perjury. The legal vice of his own making had closed around him completely. "That's a Garrity situation," said a voice from the door. "My client isn't answering that." Gus Hartley, the union representative, was a thick-set man in his 50s who wore the permanent expression of someone who has spent 2 decades cleaning up after people who should have known better. He was breathing hard from the stairs. He looked at the room, at Brooks, at Thorne, at the frozen image on the monitor, and in approximately 2 seconds of assessment, the expression on his face shifted from professional readiness to the look of a man who has arrived at a party and discovered it is a funeral. He set his briefcase on the table and sat next to Marsh and said quietly, "Don't say anything else." Thorne had not moved during any of this. He sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at Hartley with the patient expression of a man watching a chess player make the only move available to them, which was also the wrong move. "Mr. Hartley," he said, "your client is looking at a federal indictment under Title 18 United States Code Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. He detained a federal agent without cause, assaulted her, and transported her across a jurisdictional boundary while lying on an official dispatch record. We're not in an administrative hearing about a bad stop. We're in a preliminary meeting before a federal prosecution.
You can't prove intent, Hartley said.
Thorne said, "Play the rest, please." Brooks played the rest. The room watched Marsh find the badge folio. They watched him pull it out of the bag. They watched him tilt it, the specific, deliberate tilt of a person checking a holographic watermark, the exact technique taught in the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Academy's documentary authentication module, and they watched the shield flash gold, unmistakable in the beam of his flashlight. The dashcam had caught it perfectly, the angle of the light and the angle of the folio combining to produce a clear, unambiguous visual record of a hologram confirming a real credential. Brooks froze the frame on Marsh's face in the reflection of the Tahoe's window. The fear was visible. The recognition was visible. The decision to proceed anyway, occurring in real time across his features, like weather moving across open ground, was visible. "You knew," Brooks said. Not an accusation. A narration of a fact that was present in the image for everyone to see. Right there in that moment, you knew. She hit play. They heard his voice, bright and deliberate, and aimed at the dashcam microphone. "Found your forged little props, sweetheart." They heard the sound of the bag being shoved back into the car. And then they heard the dispatch call his voice on the official recording. The timestamp matching the badge examination timestamp by an 11-second interval that Thorne had already calculated and would enter into evidence Dispatch Unit 9. "I have a suspect in custody at the Gold's Gym lot, black female, early 40s, armed in possession of what appears to be a forged federal instrument. Running her in." 11 seconds. The time between seeing the real badge and lying about it on the official record. The room was silent. Thorne placed a still frame on the table in front of Marsh, printed physical. The image of Marsh holding the commission card, his face illuminated by the flashlight, the hologram visible and flashing in the corner of the frame. He looked at Marsh for a long moment. "That is the moment," Thorne said. "Right there. That is where the mistake ended and the crime began." Dara was about to speak when the conference room door opened and the room changed. Warren Marsh walked in and immediately occupied more space than his physical dimensions warranted. He was in his early 60s, dressed in pressed civilian clothes at midnight, with the bearing of a man for whom the world's default setting was deference. He had been a captain for 7 years. He had run a precinct. He had spent 22 years in a profession in which his authority was structural, and his word was institutional fact, and those 22 years had built in him a certainty about how rooms responded to his entry that was as habitual as breathing. He assessed the room in the way that people trained in command assess a room threat levels, relationships, power structures. And he made his assessment quickly and incorrectly, because the room he was looking at was not organized the way rooms he was used to were organized. The woman in the navy suit with the laptop was not a records administrator. The man in the charcoal suit was not a liaison, and the woman in the gray hoodie with the bandaged wrists was not, despite her appearance, the problem. "What is this?" Warren said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who has decided in advance that this is a misunderstanding. "I get a call that my son is being questioned without proper counsel." "He has counsel," Brooks said, pointing to Hartley. "And he's not being questioned. The administrative review is underway." Warren looked at Gus with the expression of a man who had expected better from the people he paid for. Then he looked at Dara. "So you're the one," he said. He took her in the hoodie, the leggings, the bandaged wrists, and arrived at a conclusion without the courtesy of concealing it. "You probably gave him attitude. My son is 23 years old. 4 months on the street. He made a judgment call in the dark, in the rain. A call based on his training and his read of the situation. That is what officers do. You people are blowing this completely out of proportion," Dad Cody said. His voice was very quiet. "I'll handle this," Warren said, and he stepped toward the table toward Dara with the confident approach of a man who has managed situations through proximity and the implicit threat of his standing for 2 decades. "Listen, my family has bled for this county for 22 years. That means something here. I have relationships with the chief's office, with the county administrator, with people in this building who will be here long after any federal interest in this situation has moved on. You drop this complaint, the department issues a formal apology, Cody goes back to work, and everybody goes home. But if you try to burn my son's life down over a misunderstanding in a parking lot, I will make sure that every complaint, every anomaly, every administrative notation in your personnel file is on the front page of the Washington Post by Friday morning. Do you understand me? The room was very still. Dara did not respond to Warren Marsh. She did not look at him with anger or with fear or with the hot immediate reaction that his words were calibrated to produce. She turned with a deliberateness that was more devastating than any direct confrontation to the center of the conference table, where a speakerphone had been placed at the start of the review. "Director Carter," she said, "did you get all of that?" The speaker crackled. Every word Carter said. Warren Marsh's face changed. "That sounded to me," Carter continued in a voice that had the quality of something very heavy being placed on a surface with great care, like witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. Spoken in front of a lieutenant of internal affairs, a Department of Justice prosecutor, a precinct captain, and a federal agent. Warren looked at the speakerphone. He looked at Dara. He looked at Thorne. For the first time since he had walked into the room, his certainty showed its seams. "Who is that?" he said. "That is the assistant director of the FBI Washington field office," Dara said. "And you just threatened a federal witness in front of everyone in this room." She looked at him for a long moment, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with the steady, impassive regard of someone recording a fact. "Mr. Warren Marsh, you are under arrest." She nodded to the two tactical agents in the doorway. Warren Marsh stood there for 3 seconds in which the 22 years of accumulated certainty tried to find purchase in a room that had no surface left to hold it. Then the tactical agents moved and his hands went behind his back and the handcuffs closed. Cody watched his father be walked out of the room. The expression on his face was the most human thing in it, not the performed courage of the parking lot, not the desperate calculation of the booking area, but the raw, undefended look of a child watching something be taken away that he had always believed was permanent. They walked him out through the back. Not through the bullpen where the night shift officers were working, not past the booking desk where Dylan was still managing the aftermath, but through a service corridor that smelled of cleaning products and old paint out a side door into the parking lot. This was a courtesy, or something like one. A preservation of what was left of his professional dignity. He did not know how to feel about it. He sat in his personal vehicle in the employee lot for 11 minutes. He had counted. He sat with his hands on the steering wheel and the engine off and the rain hitting the roof of the car in the same steady rhythm it had been hitting everything all night, and he tried to construct a version of the night's events that was survivable. He could not do it. He drove home. 48 hours later, Gus Hartley called. His voice had the careful, measured optimism of a man who is professionally obligated to find silver linings in weather systems that are mostly catastrophic. The federal charges, Gus said, required a grand jury convening, and that took time, weeks, maybe months. The dashcam footage was damning, but Thorne had a full docket and multiple active cases, and the wheels of federal prosecution moved slowly. There was a version of this, not a good version. Gus was careful not to say good, but a version in which Cody pleaded to a misdemeanor, deprivation of rights, charge, served no prison time, paid a fine, completed a period of probation, and eventually, perhaps in 18 months, perhaps 2 years, applied to a smaller department in a different county. Not Fairfax, but somewhere. Cody listened to this and found that he wanted to believe it more than he could assess its likelihood, and he chose to believe it anyway, because the alternative was a gravity he couldn't survive standing up. His father's bail hearing was on Thursday. Warren Marsh, 58 years old, is 22 years of distinguished service. No prior record, the magistrate set bail at his own recognizance with the condition that he not contact Agent Okafor or any member of the FBI's Washington field office. Warren was home by afternoon. He called Cody from the kitchen. His voice was tighter than usual, stripped of some of its automatic confidence. The way a voice sounds when the room it was built for has changed dimensions, but it was still there, still fundamentally. Warren Marsh's voice still capable of the specific reassurance that had organized Cody's understanding of the world since he was small.
"You're going to be fine," Warren said.
"We Marshes always land on our feet." Cody found that he needed this to be true with an intensity that bypassed analysis. He said yeah and meant it, and went back to watching the game. He did not know that at the moment his father said, "We Marshes always land on our feet," Dara Okafor was in a conference room at the J. Edgar Hoover building requesting a federal subpoena for his 4-month service record. He did not know that she had already found Robert Ellis. He did not know that the dashcam footage from his cruiser had been entered into a federal evidence database and was being reviewed by a DOJ attorney who had annotated the 11-second badge interval in bold red type and placed it at the front of a preliminary indictment draft. He was watching football. He was starting to feel like he might be fine. It was the last Sunday afternoon of peace he would ever have. Dara Okafor did not have Sunday afternoons. She had not had Sunday afternoons in the way that most people meant the particular quality of unhurried low-stakes time, the feeling of the week not yet pressing in since Patrick Reeves had died at his desk 18 months ago. And she had taken on his caseload in addition to her own and decided that the way to honor what he had left unfinished was to finish it. She was at her desk in the Hoover building on Sunday when the subpoena for Marsh's service record came through. She reviewed it that afternoon and found what she had been looking for, the pattern that turned a bad individual decision into a documented practice, the difference between a case file and a portrait. 23 traffic stops in 4 months. 19 of the 23 stops involved Black or Latino drivers. 11 of the 23 had resulted in citations that were subsequently dismissed in each case, either because the citation's stated basis was contradicted by dash or body cam footage, or because the driver had successfully contested it before a magistrate. 7 of the 11 dismissed citations had been issued in circumstances that matched the Robert Ellis stop, precisely clean driving record compliant behavior, no observational basis for the stop, in the available footage citation issued regardless. She requested contact information for the drivers. One by one, she and Darnell made calls. Robert Ellis called back on a Tuesday evening. He was quiet on the phone, not frightened exactly, but careful in the way a person is careful when they have learned that being uncareful has costs. He said that the citation had cost him 4 hours in a magistrate's courtroom on a day he had taken unpaid leave from work to attend. He said that when the magistrate had dismissed it, after reviewing the dashcam footage, Cody had not realized the car's system had preserved. She had looked at him with an expression that he had filed away and not discussed with anyone because there was no one to discuss it with who would understand what it meant to be looked at that way. He said yes, he would testify. 3 other drivers said yes as well. Darnell managed the Marcus Webb situation in parallel. Webb had surfaced in Baltimore, where Darnell had 2 assets who monitored the community Marcus moved through and who sent word through back channels that Webb was scared, convinced he had been burned, but not yet gone. Darnell made contact through a trusted intermediary. It took 4 days and a direct call between Webb and Carter before Webb agreed to return to active cooperation. A new meeting point, a new security protocol. The flash drive still in his possession, the decryption keys still intact. The ledger operation was not dead. It was rerouting. Dara pulled Marsh's academy training records. She found the documentary authentication module, the specific course, the specific lesson, the specific content covering holographic microprinting on federal credentials. She pulled the course completion record showing Marsh had passed with an 87% score. She forwarded it to Thorne with a 2-sentence note that Thorne later described to colleagues as the most efficient evidentiary communication he had received in 20 years of prosecution. She did all of this while her wrists healed and the bruising moved through its color cycle. Red, purple, green, yellow. Gone with the same patient precision with which she did everything. She thought about Brianna Cole. She thought about the parking lot and the rain and the 8 seconds. She thought about what kind of person looks at truth and decides their ego is more important than it. Then she went back to work. United States versus Cody Marsh began on a Monday in April in a federal district courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia, and the gallery was so full that people had been standing in the corridor since before the doors opened. The story had moved through the media in stages. First, the arrest reported initially as a local interest item, a Fairfax rookie who had arrested an FBI agent framed as an embarrassment rather than a crime. Then the grand jury indictment, which elevated it. Then the disclosure of the service record and the pattern of stops, which transformed it into a referendum on accountability, on the gap between policy and practice, on what happens in the dark, on quiet side streets, when the dashcam is running and no one is watching who matters. The blue wall that usually appeared in courtrooms when a police officer was tried was absent. Not thin, not reduced absent. Not a single uniformed officer from the Fairfax County Police Department sat in the gallery on any day of the trial. Cody Marsh, who had spent 4 months carrying a badge that he understood to be his membership card in a fraternity of mutual protection, discovered that the fraternity had a clause he had not read. It did not protect people who had become liabilities. He sat at the defense table in a suit his mother had bought him at a department store in Merrifield, a dark blue suit that had fit him at the time of purchase and now hung slightly loose from the 30 pounds he had lost in the preceding months to the specific, unrelenting attrition of federal prosecution. His face had a gauntness that had not been there in the parking lot, the cheekbones more prominent, the eyes deeper set. The quality of animation reduced to something more functional and less spontaneous. The way a person looks when living has become predominantly about survival.
His defense attorney was Victor Lang, a hired gun with a reputation and a fee that had required remortgaging Warren Marsh's house to pay. Lang was a technically skilled litigator with a strategy that was, under the circumstances, the only one available: paint Dara Okafor as the architect of a confrontation she could have de-escalated. An uncooperative subject, a federal agent who had leveraged a misunderstanding into a career-destroying prosecution for reasons that, if you squinted, might look like politics. It was in the room an argument that could be heard. It could not be sustained. Thorne's opening statement took 11 minutes and did not raise his voice once. He told the jury what the video showed in the exact specific observable sequence in which it showed it. He told them what the dispatch record showed. He told them about the documentary authentication course and the 87% score and the 11 seconds. He told them about Robert Ellis and the Honda Accord and the 4 other drivers and the pattern. He called it a simple case about a simple choice. The truth, he said, or the lie. He sat down. Thorne introduced the dashcam footage as Exhibit A on the second day of the trial. He played it on the courtroom's presentation monitor at full volume, unedited, from the moment the cruiser entered the Gold's Gym parking lot to the moment the Sallyport door closed. 14 minutes and 22 seconds of a rainy Tuesday night in Fairfax County that had become in the intervening months one of the most scrutinized pieces of law enforcement footage in the country. The jurors had presumably seen clips of it. It had been online within 48 hours of the arrest, leaked from a source that was never officially identified, but they had not seen all of it in sequence with sound in the specific context of a federal proceeding in which every second of it was evidentiary. They watched Marsh's cruiser enter the lot. They watched the spotlight. They watched Dara's hands on the wheel before the officer reached the window. The dome light already on the textbook compliance of someone who has done this before and is doing everything right. They heard hands where I can see them, and heard my hands are on the wheel, and heard the texture of the exchange that followed. When Marsh said, "I smell marijuana," one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s in the second row, made a small sound that was not quite a word and quickly suppressed it. Thorne paused on the hologram moment. He stood up from the prosecution table and walked to the monitor and pointed to the image with a laser pointer and said nothing for a long moment, letting the image and the jury's understanding of it occupy the same space. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you are looking at is an 8-second window during which Officer Marsh examined Agent Okafor's federal credentials. You will hear testimony from an instructor at the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Academy, where Officer Marsh trained that 8 seconds is more than sufficient time to check the holographic watermark on a federal commission badge and determine its authenticity. The specific technique for doing so involves tilting the credential to check for the rainbow shift of the micro-printed hologram. You can see Officer Marsh performing that exact technique in this frame." He zoomed in on the window reflection on Marsh's face. What you see there, Thorne said, is a person who has found what he was looking for and is deciding what to do with it. He played the next 11 seconds. The found your forged little props. Sweetheart filled the courtroom with a clarity that was almost physical. Several jurors reacted. The dispatch call followed black female early 40s, armed in possession of what appears to be a forged federal instrument. Thorne stopped the video and stood with his hand on the monitor frame and let the silence be full.
Robert Ellis took the stand on the third day. He was dressed in a charcoal suit and spoke in the measured, precise cadence of a man who has organized his thoughts carefully, because he knows that the room he is speaking in will hear every word, and he wants every word to mean what he intends it to mean. He described the stop. He described the lane drift that had not occurred. He described the way Marsh had scanned the interior of his car twice and found nothing and written the citation anyway. He described the specific thing Marsh had said, "Keep it moving, son," and the way he had said it, the lean into the window, the particular tone of a person who has decided in advance that a word with 2 syllables carries enough condescension to accomplish what it needs to accomplish. He described taking the citation. He described the expression on his face at that moment, which he had not shown to Marsh, but which he described now in the courtroom without heat, with a precision that was its own kind of sorrow. I recognized it. I'd felt it before. The specific feeling of having done everything right and having it count for nothing. 3 other drivers followed. Each described a stop. Each described compliance. Each described a citation or a detention that had no factual basis in anything their driving had produced. The composite picture was not dramatic in the way that courtroom drama is usually dramatic. It was quiet and methodical, and far more devastating for being so. Cody Marsh on the stand was the worst of his 3 days in the courtroom. Lang had prepared him, coached him in the specific language of the split-second decision defense, the vocabulary of fear and ambiguity, and the impossible conditions of street-level police work, and Marsh delivered it in the strained voice of a person reciting memorized material, while a different set of thoughts runs in parallel. Underneath, she was aggressive. She was uncooperative. It was dark and raining. He felt threatened. He made a call. Thorne's cross-examination took 40 minutes and covered 2 main points with the surgical efficiency of a person who has done his preparation and trusts it. First, the academy training. Marsh admitted he had taken the documentary authentication module. He admitted he had passed it. He admitted the module covered holographic watermarks. He admitted he knew the tilting technique. Thorne placed the screenshot of the 8-second examination on the railing in front of the witness box and asked Marsh why he had tilted the badge, and Marsh could not answer, and the silence answered for him. Second, the 11 seconds. Thorne placed the split-screen timestamp comparison on the monitor badge examination on the left, dispatch call on the right. 11-second interval in red at the bottom, and said, "Officer Marsh, you examined the credential at 22:47 and 32 seconds. You filed a false report with dispatch at 22:47 and 43 seconds. You had 11 seconds. What were you doing in those 11 seconds?" Marsh said, "I was deciding." The courtroom was very quiet. "You were deciding," Thorne repeated. Not confused, not afraid. "Deciding. Is that your testimony?" Marsh looked at his hands. "I was scared I'd made a mistake. So you decided to arrest her to cover it." No further questions. Thorne did not give an emotional closing argument in the way that closing arguments are sometimes emotional. The raised voice, the appeal to outrage, the theatrical construction of moral stakes. He had never found that necessary when the facts were sufficient, and in this case, the facts were entirely sufficient. He said Officer Marsh did not make a mistake in that parking lot. He made a decision. Mistakes happen before you know better. Decisions happen after. He went to the monitor and brought up the 8-second frame one final time, the image that had been on the front page of 3 national newspapers and the subject of 11 weeks of coverage, and was going to become in time the image that people used when they discussed this case and what it meant. He did not say anything about the image. He let it exist in the room. This is the moment he said. Right here. Everything before this moment is a bad stop. Everything after this moment is a federal crime. The question before you is not whether he made a mistake. The question is whether he knew the truth and chose the lie. The video tells you when he knew the truth. The dispatch recording tells you when he chose the lie. The interval between them is 11 seconds. He sat down. Lang's closing was competent. He had a good voice and a controlled delivery, and he understood how to construct an argument from limited materials. He talked about youth and fear, and the genuinely difficult conditions of police work, and the specific unfairness of judging a split-second decision in a fully lit courtroom months after the fact. He talked about overreach and the chilling effect of federal prosecution on frontline officers. In the gallery, people listened. Not everyone was unmoved, but the jury had seen the video 14 times in the preceding 3 days. They had watched the 8 seconds 60 times in aggregate. They had heard the dispatch call and the 11-second interval, and Robert Ellis on the stand, and they carried all of that into deliberation. 3 hours and 40 minutes later, they returned. Guilty. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Obstruction of justice. Fabrication of evidence on an official law enforcement record. The gallery did not erupt. It exhaled a collective complicated sound that contained relief and grief, and something else that did not have a clean name. The sound of a thing that has been wrong for a long time being named correctly for the first time. Cody Marsh sat at the defense table and stared at the table's surface and did not make a sound. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later had a different quality from the trial. The trial had the architecture of contest, two sides, competing narratives, the procedural back and forth that gives spectators the familiar shape of drama. The sentencing hearing had no contest. The verdict had resolved all of that. What remained was simply the weight. The gallery was smaller. The press was still present, but quieter. The story had moved from its peak phase into the deeper register of consequence, and the people who covered it were no longer in the mode of breaking news, but in the mode of witnessing. The activists who had attended every day of the trial were mostly still there. Warren Marsh's seat in the third row, where he had sat every day of the trial, until his own case had produced a conflict of interest that required him to stop attending, was empty. Cody sat at the defense table. The suit now 3 weeks more worn, 2 pounds more loose. Lang sat beside him, and whatever billable hours remained were being spent in preparation for the mitigation argument, the last card in a hand that had been played down to almost nothing. Judge Patricia Weston entered the room the way she entered every room she presided over, with the comprehensive, unhurried authority of a person who has spent 23 years on the federal bench and has made peace with the fact that the court's job is not to make people comfortable, but to make things accurate. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, and she had the specific quality of stillness that comes from having decided long ago that the work matters, and that the way to honor it is to do it carefully. She reviewed the pre-sentencing report. She reviewed the victim impact statement that Dara Okafor had submitted, 2 pages, single-spaced clinical, in its description of the physical and professional consequences of the arrest. And notable for what it did not include, it contained no request for a specific sentence, no rhetorical appeal to emotion, no language about what the night had cost her personally beyond the documented physical and operational facts. Thorne had read it and said to his paralegal that it was the most disciplined victim impact statement he had received in 2 decades. Lang made his mitigation argument. He was good at it genuinely. He spoke about Cody's age, his family history of service, the impossible pressure of a profession in which judgment calls must be made in seconds, and the consequences of getting them wrong are evaluated over months. He asked the court to consider that incarceration served no one in this case, and that a sentence of probation and community service would accomplish the deterrent and rehabilitative functions of sentencing without destroying a young man who had in one terrible night made a terrible choice. Thorne leaned into his microphone from a seated position. "Your Honor," he said, "age is not an excuse for what this evidence shows." Mr. Marsh did not make a choice under pressure with insufficient information. He had the information. He examined it. He then manufactured a lie for the official record and transported a federal agent across a jurisdictional line against her will to cover that lie. That is not inexperience. That is calculation. He paused. The government asks for the federal maximum. Judge Weston placed her reading glasses on the table. She looked at Cody for a long moment. Not the impersonal scanning look of an administrator processing a file, but the specific focused attention of a person who is about to say something they have thought carefully about and wants to say it to the right person in the right way. Please stand, Mr. Marsh. Cody stood on legs that felt like they had been built from something less solid than bone. Lang put a hand on his arm. He did not need the physical support yet, but he was grateful for the proximity of it. Judge Weston spoke. You were handed a badge and told it meant service. You understood it to mean supremacy. Those two things are not the same, and the difference between them is not a matter of interpretation. It is the entire substance of what the oath you took required you to understand. Her voice was level and unhurried with the quality of something that has been thought through completely before being spoken, each word occupying exactly the space it was placed in. You saw a black woman sitting alone in the dark in a car, doing nothing. You decided without evidence and without cause that she was guilty of something. When the evidence directly contradicted that decision, when the truth was in your hands, literally for 8 documented seconds, you chose your pride over her freedom. You then lied on an official government record to support that choice, and you transported her against her will to a facility to compound it. She looked at him steadily. This is not a failure of training. You were trained correctly. This is a failure of character. And this court cannot sentence training. It can only sentence choices. She picked up the papers. On count 1 deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 72 months in a federal correctional facility. On count 2 obstruction of justice, I sentence you to 24 months to run consecutively. Total sentence 96 months, 8 years, followed by 3 years of supervised release. All law enforcement certifications are permanently and irrevocably revoked. She set the papers down. Furthermore, as your crimes were committed under the color of official right and directly targeted citizens on the basis of race, I am recommending this case to the Civil Rights Division for pattern and practice review of the Fairfax County Police Department. The department is not on trial here, but what produced Officer Marsh may be worth examining in its own right. A wail cut through the courtroom from somewhere in the back rows. Cody did not look. He knew the sound. He had heard it in his life before at the wrong kinds of moments, and it was his mother's voice, and it was the worst sound in the room, because it was the only sound in it that had nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with grief. The grief of a person who has watched something they loved become something they could not have predicted and could not prevent. His knees went. Not dramatically, not a collapse, but a giving a slow failure of the structural will that had kept him upright through the trial and the weeks before it and the 11 months since the parking lot. Lang's hand was there. The U.S. Marshals were there. They moved in with the practiced efficiency of people for whom this moment is professional rather than personal. And the handcuffs they produced were department-issue solid steel, and they closed around his wrists with the same small, unremarkable clicking sound as the handcuffs he had used in the parking lot. The sound was identical. He noticed this. They turned him toward the holding door. He looked back involuntarily, the way a person looks back at a place they know they are leaving permanently. He found the gallery, found his mother with her face in her hands, found the empty row where his father used to sit, and then, in the back of the room, standing in the last row with her hands clasped behind her back in the specific posture of someone at professional rest. Feet shoulder width, shoulders square chin level. He found Dara Okafor. She was looking at him. She did not smile. She did not nod. She did not perform the satisfaction that the moment might have invited in a person less disciplined than she was. She simply held his gaze across the full length of the courtroom with the steady, complete attention of a person who has seen this moment through to its conclusion and is marking it the way you mark the completion of a task, not with celebration, but with the quiet acknowledgement that the thing required of you has been done. 3 seconds. Then she picked up her bag and walked out of the courtroom through the side door because she had a briefing in 2 hours and the work did not stop because one case had reached its end. The marshals took Cody through the holding door. The door closed. 3 weeks after sentencing on a Thursday morning in early autumn when the rain had come back in the way that Northern Virginia rain comes back in October. Persistent gray, the kind of weather that makes indoor spaces feel provisional. Dara was at her desk on the 4th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building, closing the last of the administrative files on the Marsh case. There was more of this than people outside federal law enforcement understood. Cases generated paper, the way fires generated heat continuously and proportionally to their size. And the Marsh case had been large, involving not just the primary criminal prosecution, but the civil rights referral, the cooperation agreement with Marcus Webb, the administrative proceedings against Foster for inadequate supervision, and the ongoing ledger operation, which had reconstituted itself after Marcus Webb's return and was now 3 weeks from its new target date closer to resolution than it had ever been. She was finishing a summary memorandum when Darnell knocked twice and came in without waiting, which was their arrangement. 2 knocks meant this is important enough not to wait in the hall. And in 7 years of working together, he had used it discriminately enough that she always looked up when she heard it. He was carrying a file folder stamped in red with Cyber Division/Financial Crimes Unit, and his expression had the specific quality she associated with him, having found something that was in its particular geometry too perfect to have been invented. A quality that was not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The satisfaction of a professional confronting a piece of evidence that has the structure of poetic justice. He put the folder on her desk without sitting down. "The ledger trace is done," he said. "The $3.8 million is unrecoverable, washed through 11 exchanges, 3 jurisdictions gone." But the cyber team cracked the origin. She looked up from the memo. "I thought it was cartel capital. That was the intelligence assessment." Tate was only half right, Darnell said. He knew it was dirty money. He didn't know what kind. He opened the folder to a flowchart, a digital transaction map that had been annotated by the Cyber Division's financial forensics team in the precise color-coded language of people who spend their careers following money through the places it doesn't want to be found. The map showed the origin of the $3.8 million as a breach of a municipal server in Fairfax County, Virginia. Dara looked at the map. She looked at the breach date and time. She looked at the transfer window timestamp. The breach had been executed at 10:44 p.m. The transfer window had opened at 10:56 p.m. The FBI's planned intervention, which would have used Webb's flash drive to freeze the hacker's access, had been timed for 10:48. The cruiser's lights had appeared in the Gold's Gym parking lot at 10:41. She looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then she looked at Darnell, whose account she said. He turned to the next page. He placed his finger at the top of a spreadsheet that had been formatted with the clean precision of a federal financial document. Each line item labeled each account identified by its full legal name. The header read, Fairfax County Fraternal Order of Police, Tier 2. Legacy Fund, Defined Benefit Retirement Pool. Pre-2019 Restructuring Beneficiaries. Tier 2 is the legacy plan, Darnell said. Officers who retired before the pension restructuring in 2019. The old guard. The people who put in 20, 25, 30 years and have their entire retirement sitting in a single managed fund instead of a diversified personal account. The hackers didn't pick this fund for ideological reasons. They picked it because it was large, because it was consolidated, and because the authentication credentials on the administrator's account had been compromised through a phishing attack 3 months earlier. The breach had been sitting there, dormant, waiting for the right transfer window. Dara turned the page. The beneficiary list was alphabetical. She found it on the second page, 11 names from the top. Marsh Warren T., retired Captain Fairfax County, PD lump sum, pension. Payout and 401k equivalent, total exposure, $412,000, status account. Drained recovery, probability, pending. Insurance review. She read it twice. She set the page down on her desk and looked at it. The geometry of it assembled itself in her mind, the way the best evidence always did, not dramatically, not with the fanfare of revelation, but with the quiet, comprehensive clarity of something that has always been true and is only now visible. Every element connected to every other element with the clean logic of a physical system in which the forces have been present all along, and the outcome was in retrospect inevitable. Cody Marsh had pulled into the Gold's Gym parking lot at 10:41 p.m. At 10:43, he had put Dara in handcuffs. At 10:44, the Ledger's hackers had executed the breach command using the access they had been staging for 3 months, targeting the window. They had identified a 12-minute gap during which the fund's automated security monitoring would be running a scheduled update and the real-time fraud detection would be operating at reduced capacity. At 10:46, Dara would have received Webb's flash drive and the decryption keys. At 10:48, the FBI would have frozen the hackers' access. The breach command would have been interrupted. The $3.8 million would never have moved. But at 10:43, Cody Marsh had put Dara in handcuffs. And at 10:44, the hackers had executed the command. And at 10:56, the transfer window opened. And the $3.8 million moved through 11 cryptocurrency exchanges in 47 minutes and was functionally gone. Cody Marsh's ego had held the door open for the people who robbed his own father blind. He had not known this. He had not intended this. He had been standing in the parking lot in the rain, manufacturing probable cause and performing for his dashcam, entirely unaware that 3 miles away, in a server rack in a municipal building, a 12-minute window was closing, and the consequences of his choices were already moving at the speed of a financial transaction through a digital architecture he had never heard of and could not have imagined. This was not a comfort. It was simply a fact. The consequences had not required his intent. They had only required his action. "It gets worse," Darnell said in the tone of a person who does not believe it is worse, who believes in fact that what he is about to describe is the universe demonstrating a preference for proportion. He pulled the next page from the folder. The insurance company managing the Tier 2 Legacy Fund had reviewed the breach and issued a preliminary determination. Their policy, which had been drafted in the period before cryptocurrency facilitated financial crime, had become a primary threat vector, classified the type of breach that had drained the fund as user-initiated credential compromise, meaning that because the hackers had used phishing to obtain a legitimate administrator's login credentials, the breach was categorized as user error rather than external intrusion. The policy's language was specific and unambiguous. User error claims were covered up to 15% of the total loss. The remaining 85% would be subject to litigation. The litigation could take, according to 3 independent legal estimates Darnell had obtained, between 7 and 12 years. The money was gone. Warren Marsh, currently serving an 8-month sentence in a federal minimum security facility on the obstruction and witness intimidation charges, had his entire retirement savings in the Tier 2 fund. The lump sum payout from his 22 years of service, the accumulated 401k equivalent, the entirety of the financial structure that was supposed to constitute the floor of his later years, $412,000, effectively gone, pending a decade of insurance litigation that would cost its own legal fees to prosecute. And the house was gone too. The house that Warren Marsh had leveraged in full to pay Victor Lang's retainer for Cody's defense. The bank, citing the default on the mortgage payments that had begun when the leverage was applied, had initiated foreclosure proceedings 4 days after Cody's sentencing. The family would have until the end of the year. Dara sat at her desk and looked at the full accounting on paper and felt something that was not satisfaction, that was too simple a word for it, but something that contained the specific weight of completed things, the sense of a system that had run its full course to its natural terminus. Warren Marsh had walked into a federal conference room and threatened a federal witness in front of 4 officials and a speakerphone. He had threatened her with the thing he believed in most, the legacy of the Marsh name, the 22 years, the pension and the reputation and the relationships with people who mattered. And he had done it because he believed with the comprehensive certainty of a man whose certainty had never been seriously tested that these things made him untouchable. The thing he had used as a weapon had already been taken. It had been taken by the same forces he had raised his son to serve in the name of the same badge he had raised his son to worship in a 12-minute window that his son's choice had held open. Darnell asked with the careful neutrality of a person who has read the room correctly. "Do you want to send this to the press?" The headline writes itself. "Rookie cop holds door for thieves who rob dad's pension." Dara was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the October rain moved against the glass in the same diagonal sheets it had moved in on the night of the parking lot. She thought about the 8 seconds. She thought about "found your forged little props, sweetheart." She thought about the dispatch call and the 11-second interval and the red furrows on her wrists that had taken 3 weeks to fade completely. She thought about Patrick Reeves and Brianna Cole and Marcus Webb and 21 months of work and the $3.8 million that was gone. And she thought about Warren Marsh in a minimum security facility and Cody Marsh in a federal correctional center in protective custody, and the specific quality of knowledge that a person carries when they truly understand in the full depth of the arithmetic what their choices have cost. "No," she said finally. Her voice was quiet. "They already know. Warren knows. Cody knows. The knowledge is there. It's going to live in them longer than any headline. A headline is noise. What they're carrying is permanent." She closed the folder. She thought about the transfer window and the 8 seconds and the 11 months and the parking lot. She thought about how a person who had done everything right had sat in a car in the rain with her hands on the wheel and her lights on inside the vehicle and had said, "Good evening, officer," and had asked politely for the light to be lowered from her eyes, and how none of it had mattered because someone had decided before she rolled down the window that she was guilty of something. She thought about how much of the world worked exactly this way. How many parking lots there were. How many stops. How many instances of doing everything right and having it count for nothing. She thought about Robert Ellis saying, "I recognized it. I'd felt it before." She thought about the 6 other drivers and the 17 stops that matched the pattern and the ones she probably hadn't found. And she thought that the reason she was here, the reason she had spent 19 years building this particular expertise in this particular building, was not about the parking lots. The parking lots were the symptom. The work was about what the parking lots were symptoms of, and about having the patience and the precision and the will to follow the evidence all the way back to its source and hold it in the light long enough for everyone in the room to see it clearly. She clipped her badge onto her belt. "Come on, Darnell," she said, standing and reaching for her jacket. "Tate has a new meeting point, and the transfer window opens in 6 days. I'm not waiting in a parking lot this time." Darnell picked up his own jacket and followed her out. Dara returned to the Gold's Gym parking lot once on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after sentencing, at an hour when the sodium lights were just coming on and the lot was transitioning from the daytime activity of after-work gym members to the quieter evening population. She drove her personal car, not the Tahoe. She wore jeans and a jacket and parked in the far corner, engine off, and sat in the dark for 4 minutes. She was not there for ceremony or closure or any of the things that people sometimes need from a place. She was there because she had a precise mind and a precise habit. When a case concluded, she returned to the beginning of it once alone and sat with the full sequence of it, not to relitigate or to grieve or to celebrate, but to understand what she would carry forward as knowledge. What it had taught her about the people she was protecting, and the forces she was protecting them from, and the specific granular details of how those forces operated in the world. She took out her badge folio. She opened it to the credential card to the gold shield that Cody Marsh had held in a flashlight beam for 8 seconds and chosen to deny. Behind the credential card, in the small secondary pocket she had cut herself with a craft knife years ago, was the laminated photograph of Brianna Cole. She held it in the low light of the parking lot and looked at the wide, unself-conscious smile of a 19-year-old in a Howard University sweatshirt who had wanted to be an architect. She put it back. She opened her laptop. There was a new operation file, a new set of digital transaction maps, a new network of shell companies, a new set of names and accounts and patterns that needed to be followed all the way back to their source. The ledger had been disrupted, but not destroyed. The $3.8 million was gone, but the cell that had received it was still operating, and Webb had new intelligence on their next acquisition target. There was work to do. There had always been work to do. She had never understood the people who saw that as a burden. She looked at the empty corner of the lot where the Tahoe had been parked. The asphalt was just asphalt. The sodium light overhead buzzed the same way it had buzzed that night. The rain was not falling tonight. She closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about Brianna Cole. She thought about Patrick Reeves. She thought about the 19 years and what they had cost and what they had produced. Then she opened her eyes and opened the operation file and began to read. Robert Ellis received a letter from the Fairfax County Police Department on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Cody Marsh's sentencing. He was at his desk at the accounting firm in Tyson's Corner when it arrived in the mail in a standard government envelope with the department's seal in the upper left corner. And he opened it with the care of a person who has learned to be careful about things that arrive from official sources. It was 2 paragraphs. The first acknowledged that the citation issued to him by Officer Cody Marsh on the evening of the stop had been found upon review to lack any factual basis, and that the department was formally vacating it from his record with full acknowledgement that no violation had occurred. The second paragraph was an apology. It was not long, and it was not ornate. It used the word wrong without qualification, and the phrase failed to protect without excuse. He read both paragraphs twice. He set the letter on his desk and looked at it for a moment, and then he picked up the frame that held his daughter Maya's most recent school photograph. She was 7, now missing a front tooth, still obsessed with dinosaurs, and placed the letter behind it in the frame against the backing. He did not frame it out of pride. He framed it so he would see it every morning when he came to his desk as a reminder, not of the wrong which he would have remembered regardless, but of the possibility of acknowledgement, of the fact that institutions which are made of people, and therefore capable of all the things people are capable of, are also capable of this, of looking at what they produced and saying without qualification that it was wrong. It was not sufficient. But it was not nothing either, and Robert Ellis had lived long enough to know the difference. The dashcam footage from Cody Marsh's cruiser was preserved in the Federal Evidence Archive case number 24-CR-0847, where it would remain under seal as an evidentiary record via the United States versus Cody Marsh for a minimum of 20 years, but a copy of it was also entered into the curriculum database of the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Academy the following January in a module titled Credential Verification and the 11-second standard, alongside the stop footage from Robert Ellis's Honda Accord and the testimony of 3 of the other drivers whose stops had been part of the federal record. The module was required viewing in the Academy's Ethics and Accountability training sequence, not as a horror story or a cautionary tale in the punitive sense, but as a case study in the specific observable anatomy of a choice the moment it became visible, the sequence in which its consequences unfolded, and the gap between what the badge required and what the person carrying it provided. In every screening of the footage at the 8-second mark, in every cohort of recruits who watched the frame freeze on Cody Marsh's face in the reflection of the Tahoe's window, the fear visible, the recognition undeniable, the decision forming in real time across the set of his jaw. And the movement of his eyes, the room went quiet. Not the performative quiet of people waiting for the instructor to say something. The organic quiet of people confronting something true. The quiet of a room full of people who are beginning to understand in the specific and irreversible way that you understand a thing when you see it clearly, that the choice they will carry for the rest of their careers is not the choice between dangerous and safe, or difficult and easy, or fast and slow. It is the simpler, more fundamental choice that is available to every person in every moment in which they hold something true in their hands. The truth or the lie. The footage always ran to its end. The room always stayed quiet for a moment after. Then the instructor said, "Let's talk about what we saw," and the work went on. If this story of hard karma and absolute accountability left you thinking, please subscribe our channel. Drop a comment below. Was justice truly served here, or was something larger at work? We read everyone. Stay safe. Stay